Scale and gauge, what actually is the difference? Let's find out on the British Railroader. Hello everybody, my name's Steve, I'm the British Railroader and welcome to my model railroad room, where today we're going to look at the difference between scale and gauge and how those terms are applied in railway modelling, or if you prefer, model railroading. So a few weeks ago I made a video about the difference between 00 gauge and HO scale model railways. Now you'll notice that I use gauge for one and scale for the other because quite a few people commented that 00 is often referred to as a gauge, whereas HO is referred to as a scale. So I thought that I would take a little look at that and try and work out which one's correct. But before I do that, I think it might be a good idea just to look at a definition of each word in relation to railways and model railways. So we're going to start with gauge. Now gauge simply means the distance between the inner faces of each track. A standard gauge piece of track that you would see on quite a lot of railways around the world, in North America, Britain, etc., is 4 foot 8.5 inches between the two rails. That's 1,435 millimeters. In modelling, we tend to represent that standard gauge track with either 16.5 millimeter track in 00 and HO, 9 millimeter track in N gauge, 12 millimeter track in TT scale, and 32 millimeter track in O scale. And all of those represent in some way, shape or form the width of standard gauge track. So let's have a look at scale. So scale can be defined as the ratio between the model and the real world object. So for example, HO scale is a ratio of 1 to 87, which basically means that 1 foot in the real world would be 87 feet on the model. So scale and gauge refer to either the size of the thing or the distance between the tracks. Now, I've been a railway modeller for over 30 odd years, and throughout that time I've heard the words scale and gauge used pretty much interchangeably. What you tend to find is that here in the UK we tend to refer to our models as whatever gauge. So 00 gauge, N gauge, O gauge, etc. The exception to that is TT. So TT has just been reintroduced by Hornby, and Hornby are very deliberately not calling it TT gauge, they're calling it TT scale. And I think the reason behind that is because TT is a true scale to gauge ratio. So as we discussed in my previous video about 00 and HO, 00 gauge is a hybrid. So the models are scaled at 1 to 76, so about 4 millimeters to the foot. But they run on 16.5 millimeter track. Now, if you multiply 16.5 by 76, it actually gets you 90 millimeters too short for standard gauge track. Now, for most modelers, especially here in the UK, that's not a problem. It doesn't actually look too jarring unless you're somebody as pernickety as me who looks at it head on and thinks, oh, those wheels are a bit narrow in compared to their HO scale counterparts. But we use that to represent standard gauge track. So probably one of the reasons why it's known as 00 gauge, because even though the scale for 00 is 1 to 76 or 4 millimeters to the foot, it's running on track that isn't quite right for it. Now, there are societies that do make broader gauge track that is more prototypical. We've got the EM Gauge Society, which makes, I think the track is 18.2 millimeters wide. So it's still not quite wide enough for full standard gauge. But then there's also the P4 Society, or the Protophore Society, which makes track, or their standards say track should be 18.83 millimeters in gauge. And that would be correct for 00 models. You just have to make sure the wheels were adjusted, which in practical terms means replacing them. The same thing can really be said for N gauge. So British N gauge is a scale of 1 to 148, but that's not a true scale to gauge ratio. Whereas internationally, the scale is 1 to 160. And that's correct for 9 millimeter track. So I think the reason why that here in the UK we say gauge is because actually our models are not running on quite the correct gauge track for the scale that they are. Also as well, I think a lot of it has got to do with how the hobby's been presented in this country, and also some of the advertising. So when I was a kid and I got my first Hornby catalogue, the Hornby catalogue would refer to it as 00 gauge. They never really talked about scale. Same with N gauge. Graham Farish, who was at one point really the only producer of ready to run British N gauge, they refer to it as N gauge. So when you go across the pond to our friends in North America, they tend to talk about scale. So a lot of the time when I see things in print, they talk about HO scale or N scale. And they only really talk about gauge when they're talking about non-standard gauge models. So when they're talking narrow gauge or broad gauge. So when you look at it, I think the terminology has kind of developed whereby outside of the UK, if it's a standard gauge model, an HO scale or N scale, etc., they call it scale. Even the French call it échelle, H-O. I know the H and the O were wrong there. I don't remember much French, but I do remember that they say échelle, which is basically scale. And I think it's pretty much similar for most of the other European countries. Now, I have very briefly mentioned about narrow gauge models. I'm not really going to go into much depth about them. It's not an area of expertise for me, and I'm sure there is somebody more knowledgeable than I that can take you through all of the myriad of scales and gauge combinations that are out there. But you can buy 00 models, so models that are to 00 scale, but they run on narrow gauge track because they're meant to. So this is the narrow gauge stuff that you see that Bachmann's brought out. They also do a line of it for their Thomas the Tank Engine range to represent the small engines. And over here in the UK, we would call that 009. In Europe, I think they call it HOE. I can't remember what it's called in the USA, but it's something similar. But it's all to do with running on that 9 millimeter track, which, depending on what scale your trains are, will depend on what it's representing. But normally, if it's HO or 00 and it's running on N gauge track, it's normally somewhere between 2 to 2.5 feet. Okay, so hopefully you found that interesting, and that I've been able to explain to you the differences between scale and gauge. I think at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether you say 00 gauge, 00 scale, HO gauge. If you're a modeler, you probably know what you're talking about, and other people will know what you're talking about as well. And I think it's got to the point where some of the terminology has become interchangeable. As language develops, then words get used for slightly different meanings than they were originally intended. I have a habit of calling things scale, and that's because I'm kind of getting quite embedded into the American model railroad scene, and they tend to use the word scale rather than gauge. But, sometimes I catch myself, and I do have friends that turn around to me and say, we think you're speaking a completely different language when you start talking about American trains. But that's actually the subject of some future videos that I've got planned, where we're going to look at some of the terms that are used in American model railroading and American railroading in general, and the equivalent terms in British railway modelling and British railways. Okay, that's it for this video. I really hope that you've enjoyed it. If you have, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't done so already, consider subscribing to the channel, and when you click that subscribe button, a little bell will appear. When the bell appears, click it, press all, and you'll be notified of all my videos as they come out. If you have any comments, if you have any questions, please feel free to either post them below, or you can email me directly on this email address just here. Now, YouTube, with all of its wisdom, is going to go through my algorithm and it's going to suggest to you a video to watch. It will pop up somewhere, I think in this corner down here. If you haven't done so already, take a look at it. And if you're new to my channel, go to the channel. There are hundreds of videos on there. Have a look through. I'm sure you'll find stuff that you'll find interesting. If you have any ideas for videos, get in touch with me. If you have any questions and you think, oh, I think Steve can answer that, again, get in touch. I'll happily say to you whether or not I can answer the question and whether or not I'm able to do a video on it. But as I said, that's it for me. I'm Steve. I'm the British Railroader, and I'd like to say goodbye to you from my model railroad room. Bye-bye.